Hello my loves, I'm Miss MonMon. Welcome to my channel. Today we are embarking on a vintage sewing adventure and we are making something just in time for Valentine's Day. Way back in August of last year, I was perusing Etsy when I found this fabric and I absolutely fell in love. My favorite color combination is red and pink. So when I saw the red and pink tartan, it was a no-brainer. But now, what pattern? I have been watching probably a little bit too much Sailor Moon, and I've always loved how they had those big bows at the front of their sailor outfits. So I wanted a big bow on the front of one of my outfits. And that is how I decided that no matter what I make, I want it to have a big bow at the front. I did shuffle through a few different options when it came to my patterns, but I was wanting something that seemed pretty simple to do, something that other people can also make themselves with a pattern that can easily be found. After a few rejected ideas, I ended up deciding on this one. This is Simplicity 3845 and it came out in 1952. This pattern has two different dress variations. The first one being a square neckline with really beautiful puffy sleeves that I do want to go back and make. And then the second one, which is the one we are going to make, which is a high neckline featuring a really large bow. If you are hunting this pattern, there are a few up on Etsy and a couple on eBay, and they vary in size. I had a size 16, which is a 34-inch bust, and even though I'm generally a 38-inch bust, I find that with some vintage patterns, I can sew a 34 or a 36-inch bust and there's plenty of room. I find that the pattern sizing is they always say it's smaller than it actually is because it's easier to bring things in than it is to take them out. So that is what we will be making. To share the process of making this dress, I'm going to now pass it over to VoiceOver MonMon.
Oh hey, it's VoiceOver MonMon. As always, we are going to begin our sewing project by pinning our pattern to our fabric and cutting it out. This pattern already came pre-cut as it was clearly used. It had a zigzag cut on some of the pieces, so I didn't feel too bad cutting out a true finished pattern. I then went ahead and attached a knit needle to my machine as the plaid fabric I'm using was better suited for that kind of needle. Moving on to the bodice pieces, I started by attaching darts to them that were already clearly marked out. Both sides of the bodice front had two side darts which will help enhance the bust. I then had to go over the steps a few times in my head as the instructions said that there were darts that were not marked. So by marking these points and measuring out about 1.5 inches, I had to make my own darts. Sometimes vintage patterns like to throw things like that in there. So each vintage pattern is a little bit different, which kind of makes it fun and challenging. And plus, darts aren't that difficult to do. It's totally worth mentioning that after each dart was sewn, or any seams for that matter, everything is pressed and I do go across and overlock and serge my edges. This fabric is quite prone to fraying. I just didn't want to show that in between every step because trust me, it'll be 90% of this video. With all my darts complete, I then went ahead and started sewing the opening of the bodice. So here is me reinforcing that. And yes, I am still wearing a sewing hat because my curtains will be here in a few weeks. With that sewn together, I am sewing the shoulders of the front and back bodice together. And then I am going to move on and sew down the sides, leaving one of the sides partially open as this dress has an invisible side zipper. I'm going to admit that the next part was a little bit tricky. It was the attachment of the collar bow. It took me quite a few goes to try and figure out how to finish the edges of the opening, but what I did was a rolled hem to reinforce the opening. So this is the front that's hidden by the bow tails. And once that's done, it took me a little while and a good lunch break to figure out how to actually attach the bow. As I was waiting for the sugar to hit my brain so I could actually function, I decided to move on to the sleeves. So I use these from another pattern, and I simply just sewed them down the sides, overlocked the edges, rolled a hem, and then gathered the top. Sleeves are getting easier for me, and I find that I can do them quite quickly now, so it all just comes together with practice. Here is me attaching one of the sleeves to the bodice, and I made sure to reinforce the ends so they would not fall apart with lots of wear. I do also like to sew an extra row in the armpit just to make sure that that is attached really nicely and solid and stable, because the last thing you want is one really good sneeze to pop in underarm. With the sleeves attached, it was time for me to tackle the bow, and I started by sewing the two bow ends together and leaving a little gap. This becomes an open V section, which I think helps with the curving around the neck. With that together, I then went ahead and overlocked the edges of the bow and then turned it into a rolled hem. The pattern asked for a very small rolled hem, but I wanted to make sure that everything was perfectly overlocked. I'm not that great at resetting my overlock settings, so I didn't actually know how to make the overlocking size any smaller, but I don't mind a good rolled hem. I'm really happy with my fabric choice, as both sides of the bow are solid as opposed to having a more muted underside of the fabric being shown. So if you are making a pattern like this, make sure you know whether your bow is going to be properly reinforced. With that done, I went ahead and attached the bow to the top of my bodice, making sure that everything was smooth, as you don't want puckers around this area. So I really took my time making sure everything lined up. With one side sewn, I then pinned everything over and sewed it down. You will see the stitching, but I kind of don't mind. I don't mind a little bit of top stitching. I think it can look quite nice. And this went all the way down to where the V opening of the bodice is. And then because the rest of the bow is already hemmed, I don't have to worry about it. It didn't come together 100% smooth, but I was quite happy with how it looked in the end. Moving on to the skirt. I need to cut this skirt piece 4 times, and yes, the corner is missing because the cat was left unsupervised for a whole 12 minutes. Because I love snacks, I wanted to have snack holes or, pockets. So I used a pocket pattern from another pattern that I really enjoyed and just added that to any scrap fabric. With skirt pattern that shaped, it is quite easy to sneak in a couple of pocket cuttings so you don't have to waste too much fabric. Now I am attaching the sides of my skirt together to the bodice, and then going ahead and sewing the skirt seams down the sides, and of course everything is overlocked as we go. I was really happy that I didn't have to worry too much about lining this fabric. It just sort of came together really well. It's also probably worth mentioning that the skirt has a couple of pleats in it, which were quite easy to do, but I somehow don't have the footage of that. Here I am attaching the pocket about 1.5 inches down from the top of the skirt. Attaching pockets is a really easy skill, and it's something that's totally worth knowing how to do. You can even attach it to skirts that are already made, which is something I kind of want to go back and add to some of my most worn dresses that don't have a pocket. If you are ever sewing up a project, don't feel constricted that you can't customize and alter your own preferences to it. I know that I like to try and keep sewing projects as true to the pattern so I can give an honest review, but I kind of feel like I keep repeating myself saying I wish every pattern had pockets. So just by taking a few minutes out of my sewing time, I can just add a pocket. It'll make me feel better. And when I was filming some B-roll for this project, it was so windy and I loved having my phone in my pocket because it just sort of kept the skirt down a little bit more. With the skirt attached, it was now time to add the zip and of course hem the skirt. I went through another time and made sure everything was overlocked and sealed so there would be no fraying. But all in all, this dress was absolutely lovely to sew. I did try to sew this dress sometime last year, but I think I got a little bit intimidated. I'm really glad that I went back to it this year and made it my own by adding some sleeves and pockets. And this is what it looks like.
I absolutely adore how this dress turned out. I am really glad I went ahead and made a few alterations by adding some sleeves and the pockets. I think that just really made this dress a little bit more practical. Although the original pattern doesn't have sleeves, my dream dress would always have short sleeves and then the big bow at the front. So I might go back and make this dress without the sleeves just to show you guys what it looks like. But I am absolutely team sleeves with this dress. If I lived somewhere where it wasn't boiling lava hot come Valentine's Day, I think for this dress, I would sew a very short little cape, maybe out of a red fabric, and then put a love heart patch out of the tartan on it because that would be just so cute, and have it clasp underneath the dress's bow. That would be my dream, but I do not need a cape when it is 38 degrees outside. This dress was a little bit challenging in some of the steps, but I'm really glad that I figured out, at least to the best of my ability, what they meant. I'm sure anyone who has any clue of what they're doing when it comes to sewing could watch this and cringe by how incorrect I got some of the steps, especially when it came to attaching the bow to the neckline. I got a bit confused for most of the parts. But I think it turned out fine, it looks fine, and I love it. I'm really glad that I chose this fabric because the bow is finished on both sides, so when I tie the bow you don't see like the underside of the fabric and it just looks really lovely and solid. I do wish that I could have maybe just overlocked it in a red, just sort of create contrast, but that's not something I could do. Regardless, I still love it. This was a really fun project to get into the Valentine's Day spirit. I do have a soft spot for Valentine's Day as I really get to embrace my love of wearing pink and red together. I will certainly be wearing this one throughout the year though. Maybe I will make that cape. If you'd like any details as well as some photos that I took along the way and of course of the final product, you can find all that in my blog, which is linked in the description box below, as well as links to some patterns that I found and where to get this fabric from. Thank you so much for joining me on another vintage sewing adventure. I am so glad to have you here and being a part of my little YouTube family. We are slowly growing, which is ever so exciting. If you haven't already and you'd like to, please feel free to like and subscribe to my YouTube channel, as well as find me on any of my social media, as I love connecting with you guys over there and getting to know you all just a little bit more. I will be back next week with a brand new video, but until then, be kind, be true, be you, and have a beautiful week. Bye!